Here's what I'm going to say. I use subtractive EQ, but never quite this way. And this way is just so effective and really impressive. Today, we are looking at mixing with subtractive EQ versus additive EQ to see what we can learn from limiting ourselves to just one approach. I'll take you through the exact settings I used on each version of the song, explaining my thought process behind each decision, and then give my overall impression of each technique, after which you can make up your own mind. For those of you who are just starting out, subtractive EQ is using EQ cuts. Additive is using EQ boosts. As far as I'm concerned, the question here shouldn't be which approach is better or which approach is more accurate, but rather when is additive or subtractive the better artistic or even workflow choice. That's what we're really trying to get to the heart of here. After these challenges, I can report that my use of subtractive EQ is going to increase significantly because I've now taught myself how best to leverage its use. I am so grateful to have taken on this challenge for that reason. The first question you probably want answered, is there a technical difference? If you could recreate the exact curve for cuts that you used for boosts and you compared both versions at the exact same level, they should sound identical. The real value for me, however, is in understanding how to think when you use one or the other. Hopefully you've seen the harmonic distortion only and compression only challenges. I'll put a card above if you haven't, so you can watch it later. Nevertheless, I did produce stems from both of those challenges, and for this EQ challenge, I started with a mix of the best stems from both of those challenges, or a blend, as denoted in the track names. This is from the compressor challenge. Tom-toms are a blend. That's from the harmonic distortion challenge. For consistency, I'm going to use the exact same reverb and delay sends for both mix versions. Insert slots A to E are my subtractive mix and F to J are the additive mix. Let's do a quick A/B of both mixes. So firstly, I just want to explain my techniques. For me, there are two, let's call them stages, to applying EQ. By this, I don't mean that you need two lots of EQ, but it's not wrong if you do. Okay? In some instances here, you'll see that I've got some EQ and then I've got some more on top of that. It's probably more to do with something providing a broader stroke and something that can narrow in and really focus on certain areas. The first stage is when I focus on shaping tone on the individual tracks, disregarding their context in the mix. Now, I say this having mixed long enough to predict reasonably accurately how most decisions will play out. So I start out shaping in solo with the intent of adjusting that EQ later in context with the other tracks. I level matched all of my decisions. So in the Additive EQ challenge, I cycled between boosting what I wanted to hear more of and backing off the output to accurately assess that EQ adjustment. And then, of course, adjust and repeat as needed. The second EQ stage involves adjusting the output of each track in context with the mix. You are most likely looking at both stages combined. You're looking at where I ended up, not how I got there, but now you know. One thing to point out here is that there are subtle things that are happening on the mix bus. Probably the biggest boost there of 3 dB. And for the bass, okay, without, and the subtractive mix. Sound effects. Bit of a compressor there to tame some of those peaks. Same for this version. We've gone for slightly thinner sounding guitars. Bit of dynamic EQ there just to get some of the low mid frequencies out of the way.
I got this feeling once again. I think I'm knock on number 10. She got the Mercedes Benz. She got the perfect 10. I got this feeling once again. I think I'm knock on number 10. She got the Mercedes Benz. She got the. I got this feeling once again. I think I'm knock on number 10. She got the Mercedes Benz. She got the perfect 10. Calling out my name, calling out the window. She's calling out my name. Calling out the window, she's calling out my name. Calling out the window, calling out my name.
Okay, that's, not a lot happening in terms of like that's the biggest subtraction there, which is from 2.4 kilohertz. And then we've got complementary boost in the bottom and top.
Calling out my name, calling out the window, she's calling out my name. Calling out the window, calling out my name, calling out the window, she's calling out my name, calling out the window.
And then lastly, we have the backing vocals. There you go. That is just an overall comparison between those two. Let's have a listen to the first verse and a little bit of the pre. And the additive mix. So the biggest thing that I notice is how quickly additive EQ allows you to draw focus to something. It's a very satisfying approach because of its immediacy with results. If an element in the mix needs more attention, boosting is definitely the way to go. But if you're not sure, then ask yourself, are you boosting to compensate for a lack of tone or to overcome masking issues created by another instrument? If it's a masking issue, then I would identify the culprit and apply subtractive EQ to that instrument first. Masking is something you may not completely understand, but I'll explain it like this. If I place my hand in front of my mouth when I talk, the sound appears to change. In reality, when I move it away, nothing has changed. Okay, my voice tone is just obscured by my hand in front of my mouth. Much the same way that too much of a particular frequency from one instrument or multiple instruments can obscure the true quality of another. If I encountered frequencies I normally remove with subtractive EQ, I simply just boosted another frequency band to mask it. Let me see if I can find an example of that. Say, for example, I didn't need as much of this region. I've initially boosted the top end, and what you generally find with the boost like that is that with bigger boosts, you generally need to complement that with another boost at the opposite end of the spectrum to balance that out. Essentially, you're applying way too much of that first frequency to mask a problem to the point of that first frequency becoming annoying, and then masking that with a complementary boost to deliver the right balance for the individual track. Or at least that's the way that I've been doing it. Subtractive EQ, well, initially I would say that I struggled to get the tone that I wanted on individual tracks using subtractive EQ. All I could think was, if only I could boost, this would be so much easier. Instead, I persevered and started to think in opposites. If I wanted to add more top end to a track, I had to cut low frequencies to reveal that top end. I was, in effect, listening to that top end while I made the low end adjustment, which was quite a shift in mindset. You know, something like that is a really good example, okay, on the sound effects track. And then the next stage was pretty much just inspired by mix engineer Manny Marroquin. Manny talks about building a mix around one element, and this could be the lead vocals, or it could be another element like an 808 kick. So in the case of this, I would solo safe it, meaning that anything, like if I was working on the guitars, the vocals were still running in the background.
I got this feeling once again. I think I'm knocking on number 10. She got the Mercedes Benz. She got the perfect 10. I fantasize about her. I realize those bedroom lights are.
That was my approach for that. So what I was listening for was masking. It's really just a matter of taking away from the other instrument, in this case, the guitars, what is subtracting from the clarity or focus of the main instrument. The way you do that is you grab an EQ. Perhaps you know straight away what that frequency is, but maybe you don't. If you don't know what frequency that is, you boost and you sweep around until something really starts to mask the vocal, and you pull it out. And then you maybe balance out the output, you bypass it, you have a listen back and forth, and then you just keep going through that process until you get the clarity that you want on the lead vocal, okay? And what I found was that by just focusing on the two elements at a time, I was able to completely change the character of the vocals for the better. And so, like, before you know it, you've actually cleared out the mix nicely because you've become so much more effective at identifying these masking issues by pairing up instruments. Obviously, places to start are vocals against the guitars. Guitars typically occupy quite a lot of the same area of the spectrum as the vocals. But the key is not to listen to the guitars, but to focus on the vocals as you sweep through the frequencies. Vocals versus backing vocals was another pair. Maybe not so obvious is guitars against the bass. Top of the bass can affect the low end of the guitars or vice versa. It just really depends on which of those two you want to draw focus to. So kick versus the bass guitar, you know, if you want that kick to be more prominent than the bass guitar, then you start cutting away from the bass guitar. After that, I spent time listening through and stopping when I felt like I heard an issue. And at one point, the hi-hat and the percussion parts were overlapping frequency-wise and making each other sound brittle. And so I just needed to choose a president and make the other a vice president by cutting something out. The difference really is that I feel like the subtractive mix allows everything to coexist and be heard, where everything is clear, but without being in your face. Think of it like adding a vignette to a photo. The moves were generally more subtle or harder to hear, especially the ones that were made in context to address the masking issues, but the difference is just huge. The additive mix feels like it shines spotlights on different elements. It's punchy, perhaps drier, more upfront, and you could reasonably argue that the elements feel slightly disconnected in comparison. Here's what I'm going to say. I use subtractive EQ, but never quite this way. And this way is just so effective and really impressive. It's a complete change in mindset, which comes with its own learning curve, but geez, is it worth it? I also learnt that additive is great for shining the spotlight and pulling parts in the mix forward. My personal takeaway is this: if you first properly address all the masking issues that you have using subtractive EQ, then you will likely not need to boost as often. And don't get me wrong, both techniques are useful and great as long as you choose wisely. I hope you enjoyed that and learnt something too. Thank you to my Patreon supporters and to my subscribers. Please like, share this video if you really liked it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Happy mixing, guys. See you next time.